Welcome to another edition of Anglican Unscripted. This is episode 55, and you're probably going, hey, Men in Black. Well, no. We're two men who talk about the Anglican Church, the news, the events, the things, the people, the happenings. I'm Kevin Carlson.
And I'm George Conger, and today is November 3rd, 2012.
George, moving on here to story one, GAFCON Part 2. There's been rumors floating around, and I guess there's now been a date and time set in Athens, Greece for the next GAFCON movement meeting. What's going on, George?
At the Fellowship of Confessing Anglicans Primates meeting, the FCA is the organization that came forward from the GAFCON meeting in 2008 in Jerusalem.
Mm-hmm.
And GAFCON, by the way, stands for Global Anglican Future Conference, GAFCON. At the meeting in Dar es Salaam last month, they've decided to hold a second meeting 5 years after the first, and they've picked October 2013, and the venue is Athens, Greece.
Now, what's interesting is that the first GAFCON, you and I were there. You were a journalist for, who were you there on behalf at that time?
Church of England newspaper
Okay.
and the Living Church magazine.
And I was there on behalf of AnglicanTV. We videotaped the whole event. But what was interesting is, at that point, there were 8 archbishops. 7 of those archbishops have retired, and we have a whole new freshman crew coming into the next GAFCON 2. My question is, what can GAFCON 2 do that GAFCON 1 didn't? Because GAFCON 1 produced the Jerusalem Declaration. Obviously, we're not going to produce another one of those. Called for a new Anglican presence here in North America. That produced the Anglican Church in North America, headed by Archbishop Duncan. We're not going to repeat that. What new can GAFCON 2 do?
What new can GAFCON 2 do? That's
Hey.
very euphonic. I like that. Well, part of that's the problem for GAFCON 2. Do they become a movement, or are they just sort of a rah-rah session?
Mm-hmm.
In other words, is this going to be a pep rally? Look at all the great things we've done, all the great things we believe. Aren't we a great bunch of people? Let's go forward. That's one level of the conference. The second is, do we seek to really reform the Anglican Communion? Perhaps change the GAFCON movement into a pan-Anglican Congress movement, where gathering of people from across the communion, not just bishops, not just well-heeled or well-connected clergy, but the real people who make the churches grow and live and breathe around the world, gather them together in a Congress to sort of chart the future of the church. Because the church aren't just the archbishops.
No, they're not. And what's interesting is we see all the broken parts of the instruments of unity, like the ACC 15 going on right now in New Zealand, the Archbishop of Canterbury, Lambeth, primates meetings. Those are currently dysfunctional. The only thing functional you and I have attended in the last several years was GAFCON. They got together, they prayed, they put together a way forward, they followed the way forward, and it wasn't just huff, it was huff and they had puff. And it was,
Kevin, I'll slightly pick a bone with you, because the primates meeting in 2007 in Dar es Salaam and in 2005 in Dromontine in Northern Ireland, they were effective. They were on the ball, they set an agenda, they followed up with it. The 1998 Lambeth Conference, that was effective. Mm-hmm. Rowan Williams, one of his legacies has been to strip the authority out of the primates and the Lambeth Conference to make them basically gab fests. And you're right, GAFCON can fill the void that basically is being filled by the bureaucrats in London as the source of authority within the communion.
And that's why I think really taking GAFCON international and making it the next Anglican Congress like we had back before the 5th Lambeth, was it in Toronto? Where did they have that?
Well, the first one was in London in
London.
1908,
Yeah.
and the last one was in Toronto in the early 1960s.
And this was a gathering of Anglicans who really looked to set forth the course of Anglicanism. They were dealing with marriage. Really, gay marriage? No. What type of marriage were they dealing with, George?
Well, one of the issues, well, in the 1960s, you remember you've got the decolonialization. The African nations are gaining their independence, and the church in the developing world is gaining its footing. And one of the issues that was being discussed in great detail was marriage. What do you do when you have a polygamist who becomes a Christian and he's got 8 wives? Do you say goodbye to wives 2 through 8? Because a Christian can only have 1 wife. Or do you include all of them in the Christian family and say take no more, and your children can't become polygamists? What do you do about polygamy in the United States?
Yeah, 50%.
Which is not an HBO's channel, but it's called divorce and remarriage. When
Yeah.
somebody can have 4 or 5 wives in a row, that's polygamy. They're just not polygamists all at the same time. The church began to deal with what do we understand marriage to be, not from a dry, arcane, theological perspective that had no real connection to the people, but from a perspective that was theological and practical and pastoral and scriptural, most of all scriptural.
Well, one of the dangers a GAFCON movement can have is, in part, become a parallel church. We're more holy, we have better doctrine, we can set forth a future, and look, we have success. We will become the new Anglican Church. Another one is they are so successful that they get the attention of places like United Nations and people with coffers and money who want to use the GAFCON resources to do their ministries, and they take over because they have money and influence, and all of a sudden become another Kappa, another all-African conference, where everything was right from the start, but once the United Nations and people with money got involved, the theology was thrown out, and it just became a works of the church.
And the other danger GAFCON faces is the danger that I think was best was epitomized by something John Allen, the former presiding bishop of the Episcopal Church, once said. He once stood up at a House of Bishops meeting and confessed that he loved the church more than he loved God. What that meant was it was more important for him to be an Episcopalian than to be a Christian, that the institution was an end in itself, not Jesus Christ being the end. And there's a danger that GAFCON exists solely for the perpetuation of GAFCON rather than spreading and sharing the good news of Jesus Christ. We see that with a lot of these Anglican instruments of communion, that they exist solely to employ people, solely to have meetings, solely to be shown to be doing something to justify their existence, when their existence has only one purpose, and that's to make Jesus known to the world. And when they're not doing it, they're wasting their time and their money.
Yeah, and here's an important thing. Kevin, George, why aren't you telling us the exact date? Well, that hasn't been set yet. Hopefully by our next episode, we'll know the exact date in October. We know where it is. We know where it was going to be. It was actually going to be in Cyprus first. Then they were going to go back to Jerusalem, and they were just led away from those places for political reasons. I guess there was some Islamic conflict with Jerusalem. They were just kind of saying, yeah, probably not the safest place right now when we're dealing with our issues. Cyprus was not Anglican politically correct enough.
And the Bishop of Cyprus, Michael Lewis, is not a fan of the GAFCON movement.
Yeah. And we also know that there'll be more primates attending this meeting than the previous meeting, which is exciting. It's a growing thing because of its success the first time.
And they also have to pick a place where the people can come and get visas.
Yes.
See, one of the jokes about the ACC was that some of the members can't go to New Zealand because they can't get a visa from places like South Sudan or Ghana.
Yeah.
So you need to have it in a place where people can come and go.
Well, yeah, you have to, 3 places for the great meeting. You have to have holy sites to tour. I mean, that's one of the primal things that GAFCON wanted in Jerusalem. We want to be able to go see some of the holy sites. That's why they chose Cyprus initially. There's lots of holy sites there. They're going to settle with Athens because there's holy sites. But you also have to be able to bring everybody in. And locking out the Africans or locking out some people from strange European countries isn't going to help at all. And we'll have to see. But yes?
One thing that I think we should remind people is that, and this will be foreign to most Western Christians,
Yeah.
in Africa, especially in West Africa and Nigeria, the idea of Christian pilgrimage is very, very strong.
Sure.
In other words, they live in a culture where the Muslims, who are their neighbors and the people all around them, they go to Mecca. And Christians have developed a similar feeling of the importance of traveling on pilgrimage to the holy sites. Now, Christians in the West used to do this in the Middle Ages and go on pilgrimage, but for Nigerians and Ghanaians and people from Kenya, going on a pilgrimage to Jerusalem is a big deal.
Oh, absolutely.
And so the reason why they held GAFCON 1 in Jerusalem, because it was part of this pilgrim sense of being a Christian. And so now they're looking for, when we say it's an important Christian site, it's not just tourism, it's pilgrimage.
Well, I remember the night that we turned you white as ghost. George and I went out to a restaurant in Palestine, and the restaurant was awesome. The food was great, but you were a little offset that we were in a less than security oriented restaurant place.
Well, Kevin, I think maybe I just get a little suspicious, but you know, when you pass through checkpoints to get to a restaurant, and there are Hamas posters up on the wall, I just don't think that's the best place for me to be dressed like this, looking like you and I. We look like
Yes.
tourists ripe for kidnapping, okay?
All right, people, we'll see you in Athens. George, let's move on here to story number 2. We're going to talk about the Lutheran Ordinariate. Yes, another oxymoron. So the Roman Catholic Church has said, hey, this Anglican Ordinariate where Anglicans can come and join our church and the priests can be reordained into ministry and become married Catholic priests, we're going to open that up to Lutherans. And I say, wow, George.
It's a bit of a shocker. On Cardinal Kurt Koch, who's the president of the Pontifical Council for the Promotion of Christian Unity at the Vatican, that's the agency that's responsible for Christian relations with the Roman Catholic Church, gave an interview which happened to be published on Reformation Day, where he was asked about the relations with Lutherans in Germany, how they were going, and he said they're going pretty good. We've had some ecumenical discussions and we've reached some agreements on a few things. And then the interviewer pushed him a bit further and said, would you welcome Lutherans into the Catholic Church the way you've done with Anglicans in the Anglican Ordinariate? And Cardinal Koch said, yes, but you need to remember that we didn't come up with the Ordinariate idea. Anglicans brought it to us and we agreed it was a good idea. So if Lutherans want to become Roman Catholics and keep part of their Lutheran patrimony in a special entity within the Catholic Church, we're agreeable to putting something together for them. Now that's quite a stretch. I just don't know how to explain that.
Well, that's broken spandex is what that is. Because at what point does it ever stop? If you can take in a Protestant church like the Lutherans, why not the Methodists, the Baptist, just the Congregational Church? It would never. There's no stopping point once you agree that the Lutheran Church is something that you can bring into your folds. Now, the back of my mind says, well, is this a desperation to get more priests? Is it that bad that they have to reordain Lutheran priests? They're going to reordain Anglican priests, so bring in Methodist priests? Or is this a way to bring one holy Catholic Church back together? There's so many things you got to say, what is this guy thinking? Was he speaking for Rome, or is he getting a nasty gram right now from the Pope?
Well, I'd love to know the answer to that question. See, with the Anglican Ordinariate, the argument was that Anglicanism is that there's something called the three-branch theory of churches. That, you know, the Holy Catholic Church during the Middle Ages and in the beginning of that time split off into the Orthodox, the Catholic, and the Anglicans, each coming from the same root. And the Anglicanism is essentially just Reformed Catholicism that broke politically with Rome and then developed its own way forward. You can't say that about Luther. Even if you believed in the root and branch theory, you can't say that about Lutherans who deliberately broke with Rome, not only over political issues, but over doctrinal issues. And to say you can be a Lutheran Roman Catholic is like saying you can become a virgin who's 9 months pregnant. It's a stretch,
It's a stretch.
okay?
It is, and it's unique and interesting, that we live in these times where, we talked about how Vatican II was opening up ecumenical communications. This is really taking Vatican II to the extreme, where we're, allowing people who protested everything Catholicism was about back into the church. And listen, at the time that Luther put up his thesis, things were pretty bad doctrinally with dogma in the Roman Catholic Church. I'm not saying Luther did anything wrong. It really woke up the church to what they were doing, and Anglicanism did the same thing. I guess now somebody needs to wake up the Anglican Church. George, Monday of this week, a hurricane and a nor'easter got married right over the East Coast and produced some offspring of destruction. And we're going to talk about Sandy. Hurricane Sandy hit here, I guess it was October 30th and 31st or 29th, Monday, whatever date that was. I was out of town. I was in Denver. And I come back, and for the first time in many hurricanes, my house was untouched. The infrastructure in my neighborhood is good, but I drove through many neighborhoods here that are going to take some time to recover. And what these events in our life do is kind of take people through the stages of grief, George.
Yeah, I've been through several hurricanes, 6 or 7, I believe, and in one of them my house was destroyed, where the roof came off and I was rendered homeless and had to move, and many of our possessions were destroyed.
Uh-huh.
So I've been through what the people who in the Northeast have gone through, especially the people south of 34th Street in Manhattan and in Brooklyn and in Queens, along the river in Long Island, and along the coast in New Jersey. The first few days after a storm, there's a sense of almost euphoria because you've survived the storm.
Mm-hmm.
It's an exciting thing to have happened. I mean, this is like a once-in-a-lifetime thing. And there's a sense of solidarity and camaraderie with your neighbors of a shared suffering. But then 4 or 5 days into this, it really begins to hit, and life really, you just get an emotional hit. I mean, the people south of 34th Street in Manhattan, they're living in the third world. There's no water, there's no electricity.
Yeah,
there's no food.
That's the interesting thing here is if this hit any coastal place, a flatline place like Florida, Mississippi, Alabama, it's different than hitting a high dense population of high-rises like Manhattan, where you and I have been to the city many times. Every deli is getting deliveries 3 or 4 or 5 times a day. There's cars, trucks parked out, double parked. They're taking in the Pepsi cans, they're taking in the deli food, these things are happening all day for each deli, each grocery store in New York City. It's a constant thing. And these condominiums and apartments aren't huge in Manhattan. Well, some of them are, but most of them are very small, where you have a small refrigerator. You don't have a huge pantry like you would have at a country house in the Midwest. You probably, in your condo, have 2 days worth of food. So we are now at day 4. People are starting to freak out because that whole infrastructure is gone. The delivery systems to the delis, their food in their freezers are spoiling. The food in your freezer in the condo or apartment is frozen. It's a completely different infrastructure than if this hit somewhere in the flatlands.
And one of the things, you really have to live through this to really understand what's going on, in my opinion. Wildlife. Now, in Florida, when we talk about wildlife and after hurricanes, that means there are alligators in people's pools and stuff like that. What wildlife is there in Manhattan? Well, there are millions of rats.
Yes.
There are millions of rats who have drowned in this, in the subway tunnels, in the sewer system, or they've been pushed by the water out into the streets. So there's a rodent infection, and the rats that have survived are going to be feasting on the garbage in the streets. So you've got a rodent infestation. The East River and the Hudson River do not smell very nice in the best of times. And now that water is floating around people's first floors. Yeah. And there's something called post-traumatic stress disorder. Now, we usually equate that with like service of soldiers in Afghanistan, Vietnam. but also people who've gone through these disasters. We saw that in Katrina, we've seen this in Florida hurricanes, of people still have difficulty years later dealing with these tremendous traumas that they've gone through. And those traumas they don't hit when the storm hits, they occur when your roof is falling in 3 days later, when you've got mold on your ceiling, when your clothing is destroyed, when all your personal items are destroyed, you've got rats running around your house, no food, and there are people running around the streets trying to rob you. That's happening in Manhattan right now.
Yeah, and to make things worse, there's no water down there. The infrastructure is completely gone. There's no buses allowed in. The subways aren't working. 1.5 million people, they're slowly displacing and getting hotels and moving in with family in other places until that infrastructure has been replaced. But a person on the 43rd floor of Fifth Avenue is not going to go down 45 flights of stairs to go find a bathroom. There's these built-in difficulties of living in a high-rise area. And if they lose their electricity, their plumbing, their food, boom, you've just hit what it's like to be in the very dark edges of Africa. And
except it's also very cold.
Yes, it is getting very cold. It's 41 degrees today. And so, how do we help? Well, I think, this type of devastation isn't beyond the Red Cross, but the Red Cross is like, we don't have a high-rise plan. We're used to delivering to shelters and taking care of lowlands and tornadoes in the Midwest or hurricanes in low-lying areas like New Orleans. We don't know how to serve 1.5 million people in 5 square miles. That's not what we're set up to. But my suggestion is you still give to the Red Cross, because they'll certainly work out a plan, and if they don't, they can give the money to people who do have a plan. Via the magic of that blue icon called Skype, I have Canon Phil Ashley from the American Anglican Council. You find yourself over in New Zealand, but not for a vacation. You're there to witness and partake of what we call the Anglican Consultative Council. This is the 15th edition, and in typical style, they have really met a way to control the meeting. Can you tell me some of what's going on there?
Thanks, Kevin. Yes. What we've observed is the following. They have a very tightly choreographed agenda. It began with what we'd call mom and apple pie resolutions on immigration, refugees, code of conduct to avoid sexual harassment, and safe church initiative. No one could disagree with the substance of what they're trying to accomplish.
Well, what I also saw they're doing Bible in the life of the church, and the biggest thing that was interest to me is talking about the instruments of communion, the instruments of unity that we have. They were never really formally adopted by any body like Lambeth or the ACC, which you're at, and yet they still have a prominent role in the life of the church. They want to talk about the history and the future of how this is going to work in our church.
Right. Yesterday, the agenda kind of moved more into high gear, and they did talk a little bit about instruments of unity. But here's what they're doing, Kevin. What they'll do is a brief, maybe 10-minute plenary talk on the background and history of the covenant, or the background and history of the instruments of unity. And then they'll move people immediately into small groups. They have apparently pre-selected facilitators of these small groups with pre-selected questions that have been framed by the Anglican Communion Office staff, and a pre-selected report back process by the groups, and almost no time at all for any kind of public discussion or question and answer. So, for instance, in regards to the Bible and the life of the church, they reported back, and it was a very highly choreographed as to which groups went in particular order, the questions that they were addressing, to make a peculiar or particular case, rather, for, how wonderful this curriculum is. the problem was that when they then gave time for people to respond, everyone, a number of people expressed frustration that they were being given a resolution to vote on. It was, if on paper, only in front of them for the first time, it was being done by PowerPoint on a screen, and people were not having enough time to actually thoroughly discuss the resolution itself. So there's a very almost Orwellian heavy hand on the way in which this meeting is being managed.
Now, we saw the same at AC 14 in Jamaica, where they used Robert's Rules, confusion, the English language to really move the meeting to where they wanted to, even though they accidentally oops the covenant. How is this transformational to the life of the church?
Well, frankly, I don't think it is transformational. It's interesting to me that the voice of Global South Anglicans has been muted by some of the pre-selected speakers who are almost all from the Global North. The body itself is not representative of the vast majority of Anglicans who are in the Anglican Communion, notwithstanding what comes out of the Anglican Communion office. There are only maybe 70 people here. I mean, that's smaller than an adult Bible study class on Sunday morning at the Falls Church.
Now, I notice, I'm going to pick up my iPad here. I have a letter written by the Archbishop of Canterbury from a year or two ago, who says the Episcopal Church is no longer welcome to be members of Episcopal bodies or Anglican bodies like the Anglican Consultative Council. How do I see emails and stuff and posts that they're there?
Oh, well, they're very much a part. As a matter of fact, on Thursday, all of the delegates went down to the Tarangiwaiwai Marae, which is the place where they were given Maori hospitality by the king. And there were only 4 spots next to the king that, were seats of honor. 2 were occupied by Archbishop of Canterbury, Rowan Williams, and his wife, Jane. The other 2 by Mrs. Shorey and her husband in the seats of honor, despite the fact that Daniel Dang Bull, who is a primate of Sudan, was there, and other archbishops were there. Mrs. Shorey was given the seat of honor. So clearly, whatever the Archbishop of Canterbury said back then, certainly he's gone against that.
Again, it's repeat business. Now, is this when we were at Lambeth, we had what was called Indaba, where everybody was allowed to speak. What you're telling me here, this is a little different than Indaba. Only certain people are allowed to have these discussions.
Well, no, everybody is allowed to speak in the small groups. It's just people have been appointed to report back from the small groups. And this is part of the stage management of the conversation. I think 2 important things need to be noted about the discussions that came out of Bible and the Life of the Church. Number 1 is that because the central conclusion of the report is that how Anglicans interpret Scripture is as important as the substance of Scripture itself, context will reign supreme. And in a diversity of contexts that give rise to a diversity of interpretations, no one interpretation of Scripture will be any better than another. And this is exactly the point that the delegate from the Episcopal Church made, reporting back from her group. And then the Church of England representative said, and that also means, of course, that there can be no limits on what is a good interpretation or a wrong interpretation, because that would imply a power and a patriarchy that some people have that would be oppressive.
So it's no longer solo Scripture, it's solo culture.
That's right. Context is the word that keeps featuring prominently. And as I've written elsewhere, this really reflects the kind of secular postmodern global ethic that's no different than the United Nations.
Mm-hmm. So when do you come back to America?
I'll be coming back on Wednesday. It'll be the last day of the meeting.
Well, I hope we can do a follow-up then for the next Anglican Unscripted. I want to thank you for your time now. I know it's probably like about 8:30 a.m. there, and it was nice of you to join us in our Friday taping. But it's Saturday there. It's you're going to come back.
That's right.
It's going to be a little screwy. But thank you again for your time, Phil.
Thank you, Kevin. God bless you.
Thank you. Via the magic of Skype, I have Alan Haley, my legal co-host, on the other side, and we're going to talk a little bit about what's going on in Virginia. As many people know, Falls Church and many of the churches there have lost appeal after appeal going through the courts and have basically lost their churches. Now they have a chance to go to the Supreme Court with some of those decisions and appeals, and the Supreme Court came back with a kind of surprising twist to all this, which kind of disaffected any dentist canon in the state of Virginia.
Well, yes, we're talking about the Virginia Supreme Court here, first of all. So that court was asked to review the decision by Judge Randy Bellows that awarded all of the real and personal property and bank accounts of the Falls Church to the Diocese of Virginia and the National Church. And he did so by not applying the dentist canon, because he said there was this Virginia statute 57.1.1 that the diocese and the church asked him to say it gave validity to the dentist canon. He said, no, that statute didn't change the ancient Virginia law. There's no such thing in Virginia as trusts in favor of denominations. And so based on that, he said, I won't apply the dentist canon, but he found another route to do so by applying some Virginia Supreme Court precedents that said in the case of where there are indicia of ownership and proprietary interests in the diocese or the national church, then those indicia can be enforced. So he looked at the whole history of the Falls Church being in the church and the diocese ever since the late 1790s or so, and found that over the years there'd been so many indicia of ownership that therefore the diocese and the national church prevailed. Well, they, as I say, of all the parishes that lost under this decision of Judge Bellows, they were the only ones to take an appeal, a request for an appeal up to the Virginia Supreme Court. In Virginia, you don't get an automatic appeal of a civil trial court decision. The only appeal is to the Supreme Court of that state. There's no appellate court for civil cases. And you have to ask that court for permission to apply to it and have it review the case. So that's what they had done. They presented arguments on that back in October 16, and then they found out just this last week, beginning of the week, that the court had granted their petition to hear the case. So now the case will be set for briefing and oral argument. And in granting it, the court made a particular distinction and ruling, because the Falls Church had asked the court to review 6 points of error that it found in Judge Bellows' decision. And in reply, the diocese and the national church said, well, we don't agree you should accept this case for review, but if you do, here's an additional point we would like you to review, namely the ruling that the dentist canon has no effect in Virginia. And when, in its order granting the review, the Virginia Supreme Court expressly said, we will review the Falls Church points of error, but we refuse to review the point of error, cross point of error raised by the Episcopal Church and the diocese. So, in effect, that lets stand Judge Bellows' ruling that the dentist canon has no effect in Virginia. And so now we have 2 states, Virginia and South Carolina, where the dentist canon simply does not comport with local state law and is null and void.
However, we should make it clear that this does not mean Falls Church gets their church back.
No, that's right. In order for that to happen, the Supreme Court is going to have to reverse the holding by Judge Bellows, as I say, about indicia of ownership and proprietary interest. And they are asking that it do that on the ground of neutral principles. They said, under neutral principles, which means we just look at what are the ordinary things you'd look at in any case, namely who owns the title, what do the deeds say, how has the title been held all this time, And is there any kind of overriding trust provision, express trust provision, in the church documents that means that someone else would be able to control where this property goes if the parish leaves the denomination? And under neutral principles, in this case, then, if you don't give any effect to the Dennis Canon, there is no church document or thing that says the parish has to turn over its property when it leaves the diocese. So if it's strict neutral principles, then the parish could win. And if the Virginia Supreme Court does make that its precedent, it will have to distinguish or perhaps even overrule some of its earlier holdings.
And then the other churches, the other 7 Virginia churches that did not appeal, they don't have any
no, they
play in the game.
Right. They now have finally walked away from their property, and I saw that some of them are really quite happy to be free of the clutches of the...
Oh, yeah, geez.
Yeah. So,
having done the same, I can't disagree with that. Now, there's another interesting thing here, and that's the money. There's a $2 million bank account that the diocese says belongs to them. Judge Bellows says it belongs to the diocese, but there's an appeal on that as well.
That's one of the points of error raised on appeal, and it's the only point in which significantly the Virginia Attorney General joined with the Falls Church in asking the Virginia Supreme Court to review. And in that case, what Judge Bellows' ruling did was he said, okay, money's donated to the Falls Church before all the litigation started, and it essentially made that date February 1st of 2008. Those can stay with the Falls Church, and of course that money was long ago spent and used anyway, but monies after that date, from and after that date, go to the Episcopal Church. And the Falls Church objected and said, no, wait a minute, all of this money that we received was from people who pledged it and who expressly indicated their intent. They did not want any of it to go to the diocese or the national church, because they were suing us. Why would people give money to an entity that's suing you? And so at that point, the court said, well, we don't care. It was still in the Episcopal denomination at that time. It hadn't been ruled that whether it could leave yet or not, and people giving money to it had to know the possibility that it could go to the Episcopal Church. And the church and the Attorney General said, no, that's not right. You have to honor the donor's wishes first and foremost. Donors can put restrictions on their gifts, and if you don't honor it, you have to return that money back to them. Mm-hmm. So that's what's up on appeal, and I think that's a very significant area that the Virginia Supreme Court could find Judge Bellows made a mistake on.
Now, neutral principles in the Dennis Canon have been presented to the Supreme Court of the U.S. To take up a couple times, but they've kind of ignored it and not taken up that type of case.
Yeah,
now, is it something they just think should be a state-by-state issue, and we'll just have to conquer this state-by-state?
Well, yeah, and of course a lot of state courts have gone way off the beam. For example, Connecticut, your own state of Connecticut, held that the Dennis Canon had the force of a national law, given it by the Supreme Court. So what we're really saying here is there's a kind of favoritism under the ruling that says that the Dennis Canon, because no other body of corporate or any other kind of person other than a hierarchical denominational church has the ability like this, with one little change to its national papers, to impose a trust throughout every state on its property. And Connecticut says, we don't have a problem with that. But it really amounts to favoritism for churches like the Episcopal Church and the Presbyterian Church that put those kinds of provisions into their national governing documents.
I mean, that's true. I mean, Anglican TV, we rent a studio space here, and we can't go and tell our landlord that we want a trust in his organization. It's not going to work. I can't take it to court. They would laugh at me, and I'd be countersued, and it'd be a mess.
I likened it. I mean, one person in a comment on my blog said, well, what about Harvard? Could Judge Bellows order that all the property be given to of Harvard to the undergraduates? And I said, no, that's not the analogy here. It would be as though be as though Judge Bellows awarded all of the Harvard's property, buildings, and millions and billions of endowment to the abstract entity called the Ivy League. And just because it had been a member of the Ivy League for over 300 years, all of a sudden now the Ivy League owns the property. That just doesn't go. And it wouldn't fly for any entity other than the churches that Judge Bellows say it does. So it's kind of like as I say, a special preference. And it's something that the Supreme Court has to fix, because the courts that do so and interpret things this way rely upon some loose language in the majority opinion of Justice Blackmun, where he was answering an argument from the dissent, and he went out of his way as a rule, and he stepped out of his judicial robes and gave legal advice to churches as to how they could get around this ruling that he had just announced. He said, of course, it won't bother if you can just change your national canons and you can express a trust. Then he added the words, provided it is expressed in legally cognizable form. Well, that's lawyer speak, but what it really means is provided you make a genuine trust under state law. And all the courts that have, like Connecticut, that have held that the Dennis Canon has the force and effect of law, ignored those words. They just stepped around them. And the Supreme Court has done nothing to fix it ever since. So that's the annoying part of this. It's just, it's a crazy result, and yet it keeps happening over and over again. And I at some point it's going to get fixed, but it may not be in our lifetimes, Kevin. We'll have to see.
No, and right now we have such bigger issues. We're 4 days away from an election.
Right.
And I was thinking the other night, oh, finally this will be over with.
Well, also, if you read last week, one of the great issues concerning the Supreme Court, far more important than church property involving millions and millions of dollars, was the use of police dogs. So it was the dogs. I mean, those are the kinds of issues that seize the court these days. And now we've got a national election coming up, as you say, and the people are focusing on, what is it, the 3 Bs.
Yes.
And I don't know. It's just we've got to get back to reality here. This country it's been for too long sailing on fumes, and something has to bring it back to earth.
Amen. Well, thank you, Alan, for your time, and we'll see you next week.
Okay.
George, this is episode 55. By the time we get to 56, there will be an election here in America for the new president. The choices are Obama or Romney, and you and I discussed before in the show notes whether or not we should endorse a candidate, and I'm going to endorse that guy. George, how about you?
I'm going to endorse that guy too.
Okay.
Kevin, this is one of my pet issues, by the way, politics in the church. Recently, the Episcopal Bishops of California put out a letter saying, we believe that if you're a good Christian, you'll vote to ban the death penalty in California. And they put out this statement saying that the Episcopal Church in 1958 passed a resolution at General Convention saying the death penalty is wrong, and if you're a good Christian, you think it's wrong too, therefore vote for Proposition 34. I detest that sort of thing. Not because I'm really keen on the death penalty, but because I don't believe the church has any business in direct endorsements. If the bishops of California want to talk about what their belief is on life, on issues surrounding that, that's great. That's what they should be doing. But they shouldn't be telling us how to translate Christian teaching into political action. I think that's a line that's crossed that shouldn't be crossed.
Well, that's the interesting thing. When you look at the Bible, there is no democracy anywhere within the pages of Scripture. It's really a nouveau concept to the American shores, where we as citizens, 18 and older, without felony records, get to go and select who's going to be the leader of the country. That's an awesome responsibility. The problem is we as Christians take what we've been taught to the polls with us, and oftentimes we take that polling issue and say, yes, I believe that we should feed the poor. And so you're electing the government to feed the poor. I believe that there should be health care for everybody. And instead of letting the Christian you do it, you're transferring that responsibility onto the government, thinking that the government can do a better job than you. And it's taking away the work of the church, the full body of what Christ called the kingdom to do, and passing it on to some social government which has never done anything well.
Who does a better job after a hurricane? The Salvation Army and the Red Cross, or FEMA? I think we've answered the question. In other words, it's when you push it off onto somebody else, your responsibilities to care for your fellow man, in essence, you're abandoning your responsibilities, just making it somebody else's somebody else's job.
Mm-hmm.
And that's not the Christian message. Yes, we are to care for the poor. Yes, we are to care for the suffering. Yes, we are to reach out to the least and the lost. But that doesn't mean have someone else do it on our behalf. We're supposed to do it. And often it's an excuse, I believe, to be a bad Christian, to be a bad citizen, to push it off onto others.
Yeah, it's a strange dichotomy, because who would not want to feed the poor? You know, and that's what you're pulling the lever to do, is for some of these social issues. And, you know, the reality is God calls us to do it. And we're neutering the church by allowing somebody to do it for us. And I think a lot of the trouble with the current day church is we got nothing to do because we let everybody else do it for us. We don't know how to do these programs to have food kitchens anymore. And in our town, there's only one church that has a food pantry, only one church that feeds the poor and does these social programs as a church, because they've, since the 1950s, given all that responsibility onto the government. Now the government's coming back to the churches and saying, can we open food pantries in your basement, because you know you now have a better distribution system and know who the sick people in the community is. And hopefully that will be a shift now back to the church, where this mission began long, long ago with a man on the cross.
Well, I'm going to reveal my political leanings, but I believe the government should deliver the mail and keep the Russians out of Florida. Apart from that, I don't think they should be doing much else. It may sound like a libertarian or a conservative, but I do believe that we truly must look out for our fellow man and our neighbor and love them and reach out to the lost. And because whenever we allow someone else to do it in our name, we give up that responsibility.
And we do. And we have to admit, and I admit that since the appointment of George Washington, except for maybe 2 elections, it's always been the choice of the lesser of 2 evils. And I don't think that's any different this time around. And it's kind of like when you appoint somebody to the Supreme Court, you know, whether it's a affirmed liberal or an affirmed conservative, they get there and they do the exact opposite of what the president thought they were going to do when he appointed them. And that happens in politics all the time, because you're looking at people who are making promise after promise after promise to collect enough fundage that they can run a campaign to get elected. And that's a system fraught with error. However, you and I as Christians have one duty, and that's to pray for our leaders, whoever they are, wherever they are, because prayer is the only way will get us through.
So vote and pray this Tuesday.
Okay, via the magic of Skype, I've got a motorcycle gang on for the next episode. It's
Spades, Ace of Spades.
It's Peter Old and his new stash.
Hello.
Yeah, how are you doing? You just got back from holiday?
Yeah, I just got back from holiday in Belgium.
Mm-hmm.
And over here in Britain, it's Movember. November is the month of the year where you shave, where you grow a moustache. Now, my problem was I already had a big beard. So what I did, I've sort of shaved this sort of handlebar moustache thing. Very cool, I hope you think.
Yes.
And what I'll be doing, I'll be going into work and on my blog post next week, and we'll be basically, people will be will have to offer me money for charity to basically vote for me to either to get rid of it or to keep it on.
Well, let's go. How much would it cost to you know, in charities purposes, to get you to grow hair up here?
That would be a miracle, I think,
miracle.
to do that.
That's prayer,
So
not
one
money.
sort of thing about Movember here is that people grow moustaches and facial hair to raise money for research into male cancers.
Oh,
so
great.
prostate cancer, testicular cancer. So actually, it's a bit of fun, but it's for a good cause, and it's really catching on over here.
One of the problems we have right now is the English press, the British press, has really dropped the ball. It was about this point last time around when we were having a new Archbishop of Canterbury announced that Ruth Gledhill was able to get the name and publish the name of the next Archbishop of Canterbury. And I don't see anything in the Times or anywhere about, or the Telegraph, about who the next Archbishop is going to be. I hear a rumor, though, that next week there's going to be an announcement.
Yeah, I've been speaking to one or two journalists, and they all agree with my hypothesis that I presented a few weeks ago, which was basically that the CNC, after the debacle of the last meeting, where we all prayed for them, we all asked them what was going on, and they basically couldn't come to a conclusion. And then they sent out this press release, which basically says, you know, the work of the commission carries on. And we're all like, that means you didn't choose somebody. Just say you didn't choose somebody. After all that, I said that they're probably going to meet in total secret this time, not even tell us that. I suggested a date sort of 2 or 3 weeks ago, which fitted in looking at some of the members' diaries and when they were free. It looks, the rumour mill, it looks as though that's when they actually met, and that we can possibly expect an announcement sometime next week.
Now, in revealing the new archbishop, there's a process. They have the horses carrying the carriage up to the palace. The new archbishop comes out on the balcony with the queen, and the crowds are there, and he kisses her on the cheek, and he's the new archbishop. Is that how it works?
I'm afraid it's not quite as exciting. What happens now, of course, it's slightly changed since Gordon Brown changed how he treated it. What happens now is that the CNC gets 2 names. The first name is the candidate that they want to be the next occupant of Lambeth Palace, and name number 2 is the second name of the person who, if something happens to the first person in between them suggesting him and his name being formally pronounced, if something happens to him, like for example he gets knocked over by a bus, or we find out that he spent the last 50 years fiddling children, then candidate number 2 becomes the next head of the Anglican Communion. That name, those 2 names, with the clear priority, go to the Prime Minister. He will then formally hand on to the Queen. The Queen will formally nod and accept. And then there's a number of brief sort of checks and employment things that are done on the candidate. And then their name is announced possibly by a press release, possibly by a photo call, and possibly next week.
Oh, cool. Now, let's go through. I just heard that the Nigerians say there needs to be a new process for the Archbishop of Canterbury. We want to have more say as a communion about who's going to serve as the leader of the church. That doesn't get much play in England, does it?
Well, of course, the Anglican Communion do get a representative on the CNC for the election of the Archbishop of Canterbury, but that time around, this time around, that was Barry Morgan, the Primate of Wales. He's a bit liberal, so I can see why the Nigerians and Ugandans and so on might not have been terribly happy with him being on there. Yes, in some senses, because it is such a worldwide role, there should be more worldwide input. At the same time, the Archbishop of Canterbury is a bishop here in England. And secondly, as we've seen, the Archbishop of Canterbury is a bit of a figurehead and can exercise as much or as little power as he or she wants to. And so we have that kind of curious situation where what you're doing is electing a bishop for a particular English diocese, which is like half a county, but also the head of the third largest Christian grouping in the world.
Right. And, you know, the problem being now is we're letting the English choose the leader of the Anglican Communion.
And that's a bad thing?
Well, I got to say, the last Archbishop has not proven England worthy, where several before that have been a different variety. Is that because we go from academics to evangelicals to academics, or why isn't there an even keel in the archbishops that come out of there?
Of course, our current Rowan Williams is actually Welsh.
Right.
It was quite controversial that a Welshman was picked as Archbishop of Canterbury. Shock, horror. That was quite unusual. I don't think it's so bad. Remember, one of the candidates, John Sentamu, is actually Ugandan by birth, was one of the leading critics of the dictatorship there in the 70s, fled for his life. You know, so if he becomes ABC, that's a worldwide sort of figure, I think. Whether he will become it is doubtful there.
Well, hopefully the good news of the next Archbishop will supersede and overcome whatever election news we have here in America. Look forward to our... Yes?
It's funny that you raised that, but if the announcement comes next week, it will be a clear sign of the professionalism of the Church of England media operations to when they announce it, okay?
Okay.
The worst possible day they could announce it, if they announce it next week, is Wednesday, okay? Because the only story on Wednesday will be who the next leader of the USA is, okay? That is the only story,
right?
You know, aliens could turn up in Peking, right? But it would still be who won the vote. Okay,
Amen.
so watch for which that they pick and how they handle it.
Good point. Well, thank you, Peter. Our next episode will probably be you telling us about the new Archbishop, what you like and what you don't like about him, and that's going to be very interesting, George. So thank you, Peter. All right, bye-bye.
God bless, Kevin.
George, this is the end of episode 55, and I'm headed off to the Diocese of South Carolina. Really, there's a lot of important events happening this week and next week, and the week after, and the week after that. This week, new president here in America, or old president in America, maybe a new announcement for the Archbishop of Canterbury, and Kevin and his camera goes to the Diocese of South Carolina to film the special convention about where do they go now. They have been kicked out of the Episcopal Church. First time in history a diocese has been told to leave the Episcopal Church. And that's going to be really unique, and I'm going to need your unique help to get there. About $400, maybe $500 in expenses. Please go to AnglicanTV/donate and help me out to get a ticket, a rental car, and please a hotel. No more sleeping in the cars. That's no good. George, we've been really bad about answering viewer emails or having a mailbag on the episodes here because we get too many different questions, but there's really two groups of questions that I'm going to point out here. First is, Kevin and George, why haven't you talked about the 350th anniversary of the prayer book? Well, I'm trying to develop a special for that where we'd actually have some clergy and bishops and other people talk about the importance of the prayer book and its longevity and all that. That's why George and I haven't done a special episode or a bit on it. As to the other question, it's kind of a Clash song, George.
Yeah, should I stay or should I go now? We've received a number of emails from clergy of the Episcopal Church in particular, plus also clergy who are wanting to enter into the Anglican world from other denominations, and asking, should I stay in the Episcopal Church, or should I leave? Should I join the ACNA? Should I seek to become part of the Episcopal Church? And I've written short answers back, and the real deep answer is that there's no single answer. If God has called you to serve in the ministry of the Episcopal Church, and you are serving with integrity and honesty and theological truthfulness, then stay and fight. A good officer does not desert his troops in the time of difficulty. If, however, you feel that you cannot, with integrity, cannot be a godly minister in the place that you are right now, then you should leave, no matter where you are.
Yes, sir.
So there's no one answer.
Yeah, and there isn't, and that's the uniqueness of the situation. When you say, well, what about all these people in ACNA? If you look at ACNA, ACNA is full of people who were deposed by the Episcopal Church. It's not like these people just got up and left fruitful ministries. These people were under attack, and they really, in many cases, had no choice. Archbishop Duncan was deposed and was no longer allowed to be the Bishop of Pittsburgh at the time, and somehow, in a real unique way, God allowed these attacks to form the Anglican Church of North America. However, if you have an unopposed ministry and you're serving God and transforming lives in Jesus in the Episcopal Church, I see no reason to stop.
Yes, see, the point that needs to be underscored here is that your first obligation as a priest is to God and to the people whom you are serving in God's name. Mm-hmm. Then comes the denomination. If you feel that you're being unfaithful to God, no matter what denomination you're in, get out of where you are. If you are being faithful, if you are being a witness to that transforming power of life in Jesus Christ, and there's no hindrance on that ministry, you may be called to stay and fight for the renewal and reform of that church that you're in.
Absolutely. Seek God's will in this. I mean, it's not a universal, it's a universal question with an individual answer. What's unique about this is a dramatic time for the Christian church. It's refining its way. It's refining its role. It's hopefully becoming less of a social church and more of a transformational church. And you will have a unique role in that no matter where you serve. I got to say, I'm around the church all the time. Great faithful people Episcopalian, great faithful people are in the Anglican Church in North America and around the world. Bishop Brewer is a great example of a faithful Episcopal bishop who was even at GAFCON. You know?
Yeah, we need to recall the words of Bishop John Allen. Mm-hmm. Don't worship the institution, worship God.
Amen. All right, that's the end of the episode. I'm Kevin Carlson.
And I'm George Conger, and you've been watching episode 55 of Anglican Unscripted.
You know, that was a great way to answer 60 emails all at once. At the same time. Good, that's working. And let me do a quick marker so we can be sure that this is archived forever and ever. I think our last talk worked out pretty good.
Oh yeah, that was great.
All right. So nothing like a little entertainment. 1 second.